Imperialism in Crisis, the Third World. U.S. imperialism is the greatest destroyer of human life on Earth. It is a whole economic, political, and cultural system. It feeds on piracy of the Third World. It colonizes black and Third World people within the U.S. and divides, exploits, rapes, and attempts to buy off poor and working people. Because of imperialism, people live in shanty towns in Saigon and Rio de Janeiro. The same system is responsible for the substandard conditions of 1/4 of the housing in this country. U.S. imperialism is a parasite on the Third World and traps us in a culture of waste and death. For the benefit of imperialism, we live in a society either at war or producing and preparing for war all the time. Imperialism has its origin in the necessity for capitalism to expand or face stagnation. Imperialism is therefore the defining characteristic of modern capitalism as a whole. Its penetration into Third World produces the conditions which give rise to movements for national liberation and socialism. It is precisely because this expansion is necessary that national liberation movements are a vital blow to imperialism. Imperialism is on the defensive today. Wherever people reclaim control over their lives and their nation's wealth, it removes another brick from imperialism's foundations. U.S. imperialism is a stage in the development of capitalism, but the monopoly stage. Long before the present age of monopoly, capitalism was born out of the trade and commerce and empire building of the medieval world. The industrial revolutions of Europe and North America had their roots in the subjugation and looting of Africa, India, and the Americas. In the U.S., the end of the Civil War began a tremendous boom in the industry in the North. The years between 1890 and 1900 in Britain, France, and Germany as well as here marked the transition from competitive capitalism to the concentration of industry and finance in the hands of a few financiers and huge industrial corporations. By the turn of the century, the most basic industries were monopolized: energy, railroads, machinery, and steel. The power of the banks and financiers grew to finance modernization and expansion. The capitalist countries fought for control of the world in a series of long and costly colonial wars. The people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America resisted, but eventually skillful manipulations of divisions among the people, combined with the battleships and machine guns of the industrial nations, prevailed over the colonies. Africa was divided among the European countries in 1886. In Asia, France controlled Indochina while the European powers tried to divide up China. England dominated the subcontinent of India. The U.S., having already seized North America from the Indians and Mexico, and staked out its claim to Latin America in the Monroe Doctrine, proceeded to grab Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines from the weakened Spanish Empire, began frequent military interventions into Latin America, and attempted to penetrate China through the open door policy. The laws of capitalist competition, expand or perish, did not cease to operate with the triumph of monopolistic finance capital. Actually, the competition was reproduced on a bigger scale and at a much greater level of tension and conflict. Modern arms and technology, thought control, and social engineering tried to disguise the facts of oppression behind the mask of neo-colonialism. Nevertheless, conquest and domination have become more devastating and even more enormously profitable. What causes this drive for colonial conquest and empire? Large companies are more efficient in exploiting labor because they are able to use their great accumulation of capital in developing technology. This leads to producing much more than can be sold domestically at a profit, since the workers can never be paid enough to buy back the product of their labor. This crisis of overproduction is inherent to capitalism at all stages, but intensified under monopoly capitalism. New markets must be found and new areas for investment of idle capital. Colonized nations hold the promise of labor at starvation wages, unorganized and easily available. The monopolist goes in search of new sources of cheap raw materials in the Third World. The profits of monopoly capital are so enormous that the supply of capital outstrips the profitable investments opportunities in the U.S. This capital is invested in other capitalist countries, but most profitable are investments in colonies. Whole factories and branches of industry are now exported to the Third World. A byproduct of the huge profits reaped from the Third World is the strategy and ability to create labor peace domestically by buying off a privileged strata of the U.S. working people, reaching even into large sectors of the industrial proletariat. By the 20th century, capitalism had reached the stage of modern imperialism, since the U.S. is always competing with other imperialist nations for power and control of the Third World. It's not only an economic necessity, but also a political and military necessity. Imperialism needs underdevelopment. Image above is an eagle standing above skulls with two American flags wrapped around it. The condition for the massive development of one sector of the imperialist system, the oppressor nation, is the systematic and violent underdevelopment of the other, the colonies and neo-colonies of the Third World. The wealth of one is a product of the impoverishment of the other. This has always involved nothing less than an unparalleled looting of the labor, resources, and cultures of the people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America by the imperial powers. This begins with the very first expansions of early capitalism. For example, when the British entered India by force, the primitive textile industry of each country was at a similar stage of development. The British deliberately wrecked the Indian textile industry to force India to import British textiles. Vast amounts of Indian feudal wealth were stolen in order to provide what Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital in England. Indian food agriculture was destroyed to make way for cash crops and raw materials needed for British industry. By the late 18th century, the result was their first mass famine in India. In England, the imperialists justified their rule as necessary to care for the backward and ignorant Indians. Rudyard Kipling and other imperial writers built elaborate justifications for the British Empire which rallied generations of English people. In Cuba, when the people lived under U.S. neo-colonial control, the entire life of the island was based on the sugar plantation system. People worked 3 months and spent 9 months unemployed. No other industries were allowed to develop. This gave the sugar companies a ready supply of cheap labor, since the alternative for the Cuban worker was no work at all. The most modern form of forced underdevelopment can be seen in the workings of the multinational corporations in the Third World. The rise of the multinationals can be traced in large part to the post-World War II growth of U.S. empire. Over 200 U.S.-based corporations could now be characterized as multinationals. That is, major corporations having headquarters in one country and a number of subsidiaries in the other country. The multinationals have attempted to cultivate a liberal image. The Polaroid Corporation, for example, has defended its heavy investments in the South African apartheid regime as the Polaroid experiment. Polaroid claims that it pays higher wages to South African workers than local South African industry does. But this hides the crucial point. While the multinationals, with their enormous amount of capital, research and development facilities, and highly organized sales apparatus, can pay workers a bit more, the profits they extract from this labor are even more staggering. Salvador Allende pointed this out in December 1972 before the UN, describing the workings of two US-based multinational companies, Anaconda and Kennecott. He said, "These enterprises exploited Chile's copper for many years. In the last 42 years alone, taking out more than $400 million in profits, although their initial investments were no more than $30 million. In striking contrast, let me give one example and painful example of what this means to Chile. In my country, there are 600,000 children who will never be able to enjoy life in a normal, humane way because during the first 8 months of life, they did not receive the minimum amount of protein. $4,000 million would completely transform Chile. A small part of that sum would ensure protein for all time for all children of my country. By controlling the copper industry, Kennecott and Anaconda were able to determine how much copper would be mined and what price it could be sold for. Since copper exports account for 80% of the total value of Chilean exports, these multinationals had the Chilean economy in their greedy grasp. The multinationals would sell raw copper to their own subsidiaries in the U.S. well below the world market price. In return, these subsidiaries would smelt the copper ore and sell the refined product at the going market price. Profits were thus maximized in the U.S. and minimized in Chile. Before the Popular Unity government nationalized the copper mines in 1971, no Chilean government could even raise the taxes on these corporations, let alone influence their production policies. Any attempt in this direction were made by Kennecott and Anaconda, with cutbacks in production and wholesale layoffs of copper workers. At the same time, the multinationals were able to pay Chilean copper workers higher wages than most other Chilean industries. They used this attempt to create a labor aristocracy in Chile, a force to oppose the interests of other Chilean workers. AFL-CIO organizers were sent in by the U.S. to help organize anti-communist unions. Some of the methods by which imperialism creates underdevelopment in the Third World can be summarized as follows. The labor of Third World people has been stolen through slavery, super-exploited at low wages, and channeled into production meant to benefit the oppressor nation. Profits are drained from the Third World, where reinvestment takes place within the oppressed nation. The priorities of the corporate powers determine where it will go. The natural resources and raw materials of Third World countries has been expropriated by the imperialist powers, particularly the United States. The recent actions of the oil-producing countries and the copper-producing countries are important attempts by Third World nations to wrest back control of these resources and with them of their own destinies. Diversification of industry, real progress, and rational economic growth are prevented by imperialism. Where industrialization is allowed to occur, control remains firmly in imperialist hands, and most often, consumer-oriented industries are pushed rather than agriculture or heavy industry. This keeps the developing country dependent on imperialist technology and aid. Bottom of page 83 seems to be an image of a woman and her daughter. Page 84. Often cash crops, like sugar and coffee, are cultivated at the expense of agricultural production which could feed the people. This is a main cause of famine and malnutrition in the world. Coffee alone is the primary economic lifeblood of 10 underdeveloped countries. This exploitation is maintained only through force and violence. Corporations like Kennecott, ITT, Polaroid, and Exxon rely on state violence to ensure their investments and continued profits. Most simply, imperialism means super profits for the U.S. corporations at the expense of human lives and possibilities in the Third World. Imperialism means racism and genocide. Imperialism has intensified and spread worldwide the most virulent racist practices and ideology. Racism is built into U.S. imperialism, and imperial culture feeds on and creates racism. Racism is institutionalized as a system of control and containment necessary to enforce the exploitation and oppression of colonized peoples. In the Third World, racism takes the form of cultural warfare, the displacement of populations, and genocide. Imperialism perpetuates a mythology of biological and cultural inferiority, as W.E.B. Du Bois describes it. The white race was pictured as pure and superior. The black race was dirty, stupid, and inevitably inferior. The yellow race as sharing in deception and cowardice. Everything great, everything fine, everything really successful in human culture was white. Imperial control aims at thorough domination and humiliation of the subjugated. Ruthless suppression of the oppressed has its other side, the practice of treating colonized women and men as children, attacking their integrity and dignity, enforcing dependency with the underlying threat of superior force. Imperialism systematically subverts people's history and culture, social forms, language, art, and respect for old people, everything that identifies a person in society. As with the economy, imperialist penetration cuts off the growth of the culture. It distorts the historical development of the oppressed people. The old culture is used to imprison the people and adapt them to imperialism's needs. As Fanon points out, the goal is rather a continued agony than the total disappearance of the pre-existing cultures. The displacement of whole populations is another racist weapon of imperialism. The Bantustans of South Africa, for example, comprising 13% of South African territory, are reserved, quote-unquote, for the African population who are uprooted and forcibly removed to these poor quality lands. This is enforced by a rigid Polaroid-provided ID pass system. The Bantustans are guarded by white South African troops. From them, African men are recruited as labor pool for the mines and factories, while women are forced into prostitution in order to survive. Another example of the violent displacement of a whole population is the complete destruction by automated war of the society of the Lao people in the plains of Jars. Every day for 5 years, the U.S. carried out secret air war to destroy the social and economic infrastructure of areas governed by the Pathet Lao. The people of the Plain of Jars, with a 700-year recorded history, retreated to caves and dugout tunnels as hamlets were razed and the land made barren. Finally, under massive attack, the youth of the plain retreated with the Pathet Lao, and the remaining people were forcibly placed in refugee camps or airlifted to Vientiane to become peddlers, waitresses, maids, and coolies. From 1964 to 1969, over 1 million Laotians were killed, wounded, or made homeless by an officially denied air war. The image describes, drawing by a 13-year-old living in the Plain of Jars. It's an image of the Plain of Jars with many helicopters above, assumably attacking the below village. The final weapon of racist warfare is genocide, the systematic destruction of a people, their means of subsistence, and future generations. Today, the native Indian people of Brazil are being decimated by U.S. industry and Brazilian government expansion into Amazon basin regions. These tribal people are forced off their land, killed by raids and white man's diseases, and pacified by government programs. Their cultures are destroyed. It has been charged that 100,000 Indians are being eliminated. The U.S. government used genocidal weapons against the people of Vietnam, chemical and biological substances it had agreed to outlaw, which burn the flesh, cripple future generations, and obliterate growth on the land. This was intended to break the Vietnamese and be an example to other oppressed people. Top of page 86, an image, liberation fighters in Angola. Even in the face of this terrible suffering, the people resist. The culture of the colonized people survives reservations, epidemics, air war, and near genocide. The culture changes, takes on new forms to meet the changed conditions, as black people transform the church into a unifying center during slavery. Colonialism is not able to destroy the strong basis of the national culture. The people themselves embody it, preserve it, carry it, and hand it down through generations. Imperialism encourages the rejection of the national culture and adoption of the garb and forms of the imperial culture. The neo-colonial bourgeoisie is created by imperialism, often passes into the culture of the imperialists. But the people's culture does not die out. It lies hidden in secret practices and in the memory of the people until the opportunity and necessity for struggle calls it into life. In the people's culture lie the seeds of resistance and rebellion. Movements for national liberation are often born with a popular rejection of imperial culture and a renaissance of culture of the colonized peoples. The culture contains the basis on which unity is built. The movement to reclaim and take pride in national culture gives vitality, spirit, and fierceness to the political movement. This is a rejection and defeat of the racist tactics of imperialism. Racism is imperialism's most deadly weapon for brainwashing, controlling, and mobilizing the U.S. population in support of wars of conquest. As Fanon says, racism bloats and disfigures the face of the culture that practices it. The imperialists create racial identification with one's oppressor among the domestic white population in support of wars of conquest. They also draw on xenophobia and national chauvinism. Racism is the chief justification for U.S. expansion and colonial ventures. The imperial army has been rallied with the vile epithets that the only good Indian is a dead Indian and led into conquest by men like Teddy Roosevelt, who boasted of killing rabbits in the war against Puerto Rico in 1898. Racism is at the root of U.S. unconcern about the indiscriminate murder of civilians that is the horrible face of the war in Indochina. To William Calley and the perpetrators of the My Lai war crimes, the unarmed Vietnamese villagers, including the children, were the faceless and non-human enemy. Imperialism means sexism. The systemic domination of women is an underpinning of imperialism. Under imperialism, the organization and fabric of society, the family, production, reproduction, and all social relations keep women dependent and powerless. Sexism is this institutionalized and encouraged system of control. In the Third World, imperialism imposes the most brutal forms of modern sexism. Women are murdered, tortured, sterilized, raped, stifled, crippled, owned, and exploited under the banner of male supremacy. Imperialism fosters the most reactionary or backward aspects in feudal and colonized nations, including male supremacy. The more humane aspects are suppressed. Thus, for women in the Third World, the most oppressive aspects of both imperialism and the former society are fused and intensified. Imperialism maintains and heightens the oppression of women on a global scale. Imperialism lays claim to all the natural resources of the colonized society, including the women. They are valued and controlled as laborers, breeders, and sexual commodities. Women are cut from their economic lifeline. Where imperialism causes rapid and forced urbanization, women are uprooted into unfamiliar cities where there is no economic activity for them, forced to be dependent on men. Sex segregation in the workforce is encouraged by the imperialists. For example, in Africa, the European colonizers taught and recruited only men to use technologies and work in their factories. Women were excluded from the modern economy. If the woman is left behind to do field labor or work on a coffee or rubber plantation, she is also kept at the edge of subsistence, subject to an economy based on imperial needs and disruptions, where the traditional agriculture has been destroyed. The reproductive power of Third World women is under direct attack by the imperialists. Population control and forced sterilization is now a major U.S. strategy directed against Third World people. These massive programs are intended to prevent social upheaval by restricting population in the underdeveloped world. They have disarmed many because these programs masquerade as concern for the poor people of the world, just like foreign aid and military protection. Who is behind these programs? Family planning for Third World women is being pushed by Rockefeller, the Ford Foundation, Kissinger, International Planned Parenthood Foundation, Protestant missionaries, and academic apologists. U.S. agencies in the Third World have made sterilization and forced birth control programs a requirement for receiving foreign aid. These programs concentrate in Latin America, parts of Africa, India, and Indonesia. By 1965, 34% of all women of childbearing age in Puerto Rico had been sterilized. Sterilization and IUDs are carried to the villages of Bolivia, Guatemala, and Haiti. Women are offered a lipstick or $1.50 to be sterilized. Population control has its counterparts within the U.S. Third World women in particular are sterilized without their consent. This is not the first time imperialist strategy aimed at the control of reproduction. In 1945, Congress almost passed a bill to sterilize all the Japanese women in concentration camps within the U.S. This motion was defeated by one vote. The same men who are responsible for U.S. policy in Vietnam say that overpopulation creates social unrest and revolution. They claim that population control is their strategy for hunger, but such a strategy will eliminate neither hunger nor social unrest or revolution. People are not the problem. Injustice, the conditions caused by U.S. imperialism, create revolution. So does the lack of power over our lives and the future of our children. Women want decent birth control. Women want the choice to control our own reproduction. Instead, birth control has become a weapon of empire. Third world women are used as guinea pigs for testing and experimentation. Instead, we get coils and pills and sterilization under threat of losing aid or a few crumbs of welfare. This kind of coercion, for economic and racist reasons, constitutes forced sterilization. It is a direct form of genocide against the future through the bodies of women. Imperialism enforces a systemic terror against women. The staggering number of rapes of Vietnamese women of all ages by U.S. soldiers taken together draws a picture of the intimate relationship of violence and sex under imperialism. Rape and sexual abuse is the prerogative of the conqueror, a means of undermining women's resistance, a murderous assault, part of the arsenal of control and domination. The rape of black slave women is one of this country's major crimes. White men claimed the right to rape black women, and any attempt to defend a black woman meant death by the lynch rope. Signs of a deep love relationship between slaves led to one of them being sold. Mothers and children were systematically separated. The invader attempts to possess and degrade the colonized woman, and through her, to assault the entire culture. Wherever U.S. imperialism goes, its tourism and its armies produce mass prostitution. Havana, pre-1959, Manila, Saigon, Bangkok, San Juan. Women are used as sexual objects and discarded. There are nearly 500,000 women in prostitution in South Vietnam, leading masses of women to drugs and suicide. There are more brothels than schools. In 1969, there were 214 agencies which recruited young women from the provinces for 21,000 brothels, bars, and hotels. Operations to conform Vietnamese women to American standards of beauty became big business. Women's breasts were enlarged and their eyes were rounded. In U.S.-built prisons in the Third World, women are tortured with the special methods developed by the CIA, AID, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. There are over 100,000 women in South Vietnamese prisons, thousands in Brazil and Uruguay. They are tortured by electric shock, beatings, drugs, and sexual violence. Women have begun to transform their lives by participation in national liberation movements throughout the Third World. In striking opposition to their conditions under imperialism and reactionary societies, women are overthrowing their oppressors and creating conditions of dignity, equality, and unity. Women have become organizers, heroines, and leaders in liberation struggles and under socialism. They are organizing the masses of women in their countries. They are opposing backward superstitions, patriarchal family relationships, polygamy, bound feet, and traditions based on the inferiority of women. Women are armed, fighting imperialism, building long-haired armies and women's militias, defending the new societies they are helping to build. They are working, learning to read, organizing healthcare and childcare. They are implementing new marriage and divorce laws and practices around birth control beneficial to all women. Image on page 89 is what I assume of a woman Vietnamese guerrilla fighter. Imperialism has its origin in the necessity for capitalism to expand or face stagnation. Imperialism is therefore the defining characteristic of modern capitalism as a whole. Its penetration into the Third World produces the conditions which give rise to movements for national liberation and socialism. It is precisely because this expansion is necessary that national liberation movements are a vital blow to imperialism. Imperialism is on the defensive today. Wherever people reclaim control over their lives and their nation's wealth, it removes another brick from imperialism's foundation. Top of page 90. Sexism is a cornerstone of imperialism's power to organize the population in its home base. Competition, sex, and violence are unified by imperial culture and forged into a weapon against women. In the process of humiliating and dominating women, men are mobilized to be the enforcers. Sexism, like racism, is pushed to the level of fanaticism to justify an otherwise naked grab for wealth and power, and to try to ensure the loyalty of the imperial army. GIs are promised manhood and glory. Proof of manhood and sexual prowess is built around the weakness of women. Men are rallied to kill and not care. In army training, cadence goes like this. This is my rifle, holding up his M16. This is my gun, hand at crotch. One is for killing, one is for fun. Our movement must be involved in the fight against the domination and torture of our sisters in the Third World. We have a common enemy. The greatest male supremacists are the leading imperialists. They are Rockefeller, Moynihan, and Kissinger. We cannot betray the struggle of women in general and our third world sisters in particular. When we embrace these struggles, they are our own, and merge them with our own. We create a basis for revolutionary sisterhood and an international women's movement against imperialism. Neocolonialism. The U.S. has practiced neocolonialism for over 70 years in Latin America, but in the context of rising third world nationalism after World War II, it became the main form of U.S. world control. Neocolonialism removes the most glaring symbol of the subordination of the colonized to the colonial government. It grants formal political independence. At the same time, it attempts to guarantee continued dominance through economic, military, and cultural penetration. Neocolonial economies are subordinated to the demands of the imperialists. By the sheer scale of invested capital, multinational corporations can mold these economies to fit corporate needs. Neocolonialism trains and supports a bourgeoisie within the colonized country, not a capitalist class compared to the one in the oppressor nations, but a class in service and totally dependent on the imperial force which sustains it. The bastions of traditional strength, such as landlords in Latin America, are manipulated and strengthened. Neocolonialism relies on reactionary and militaristic forces as a bulwark against social demands from the people and plunges the vast majority into greater poverty. Top of page 91 is a map of Cuba. 90 miles off the shore of socialist Cuba lies a large industrial country. Defeats for neocolonialism. While neocolonialism is a brutal system, it contains inherent weaknesses and instability. The battles for political independence in the Third World over the last 25 years have been transforming ones, and have brought oppressed people a new sense of dignity and power. With independence came many hopes for a better life, something which neocolonialism has not provided. These popular measures have in the past forced elected governments like Goulart in Brazil or Bosch in the Dominican Republic to break with the various forms of U.S. domination. The most serious death blow dealt neocolonialism in Latin America was the overthrow of the Batista regime in 1959 and the successful Cuban Revolution. From the landing of the Granma to the Bay of Pigs to the building and defense of socialism today, Fidel Castro has been the heroic and wise revolutionary leading the fight. The first free territory of the Americas has been a continuing inspiration to the people of Latin America and the U.S. The Cuban Revolution, the only socialist revolution in our hemisphere, has grown and consolidated for 15 years. The revolution has transformed people's lives, eliminating the scourges of the Latin American continent, illiteracy, staggering rates of infant mortality, epidemic diseases, mass hunger and malnutrition, inadequate housing, and unemployment. It has created popular forms of organizing revolutionary justice, taking care of people's neighborhoods and communities, and more recently, building a workers' movement to deepen mass participation at all levels of decision-making connected with work. The revolution has launched an offensive to transform education and culture into powerful revolutionary tools. Cuba is a beacon for everyone in its principled and dedicated support for international revolution. Cuba has made terrific sacrifices to aid other struggles. Cuba's heartfelt support for Vietnam is unmatched anywhere. In Cuba, the whole people mobilized to produce for the Vietnamese and volunteered to go fight if needed. Cuba's unwavering defiance of Yankee imperialism has encouraged other Latin American nations to confront U.S. neocolonial policy and has been exemplary for other Latin American movements of national liberation. U.S. revolutionaries have a special responsibility to defend the Cuban Revolution and recognize its decisive importance to the revolutionary struggle in the Americas. We support the Cuban Revolution. The U.S. response to any challenge to its rule has always been savage. In 1961, the imperialist Bay of Pigs invasion was turned back by the Cuban people, but the United States has never ceased in its attempts to arm and build a paramilitary force to hurl against Cuba. The U.S. enforced blockade around Cuba, as well as the boycott of Cuban sugar, are the major attempts to destroy the revolution through economic aggression, which must be opposed and defeated by our movement. Repeated U.S.-backed plots to assassinate Premier Fidel Castro by the participants and forces involved in Watergate have been foiled. A violent counter-revolution. Throughout Latin America, the old neocolonial facades of democratic alternatives to communism have been overthrown, to be replaced by openly fascist dictatorships. Banzer in Bolivia, Pinochet in Chile, the Junta in Brazil, Bordaberry in Uruguay. These counter-revolutions are the work of the Nixon-Kissinger doctrine. The Nixon-Kissinger doctrine means the export of fascism to the Third World. Its theme is that the U.S. will arm, train, finance, and support counter-revolution and reaction without necessarily intervening directly with ground troops in every area in which its interests are threatened. The price of the Vietnam War was too high to pay again and again. This strategy has the broad backing of the ruling class and is not affected by the governmental crisis, domestic differences, or Watergate. Neocolonialism and the Nixon-Kissinger doctrine are ultimately based on violence. The U.S. has the most colossal military establishment the world has ever seen. Over 3,000 bases encircle the globe. B-52s are always in the air, and a frightening nuclear arsenal stands ready. There are 600,000 U.S. troops stationed abroad, even when the U.S. is not engaged in war. This is the ultimate threat behind each policy. The U.S. has been building a strong network of imperialist alliances linking Western Europe and Japan with a series of fascist governments, reactionary junior partners in imperialism. Tho, the Greek junta, the Brazilian dictators, Lon Nol, the Shah of Iran, the governments of Rhodesia and South Africa are all U.S.-backed regimes, armed against insurgents in their own countries, set up to police their respective regions. In Africa, the U.S. has increased support to Portugal. In the Mideast, the U.S. arms Israel and Jordan. In Latin America, the U.S. and Brazil have backed fascist coups in Bolivia, Uruguay, and now Chile. In no way is neocolonialism a more liberal or enlightened or peaceful system of domination. Neocolonialism is Vietnamization on a worldwide scale. Page 93 is a detailed assortment of U.S. military interventions across the globe, including China, Formosa, which is Taiwan, Russia, Japan, Korea, Hawaii, Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Samoa, Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. Back to page 94. Neocolonialism does not resolve the conflicts within imperialism. It only pushes the struggle to a new stage. To revolutionaries in the Third World, it has been made ever clear the necessity to carry the struggle to its final conclusion. What does national liberation in the world mean today? Amilcar Cabral provides a clear formulation. The liberation struggle is a revolution. It does not finish at the moment when the national flag is raised and the national anthem played. A nation's national revolution is the recovery of the historical personality of that nation. National liberation exists when, and only when, the national productive forces are completely freed of all kinds of foreign domination. Cabral spoke as an African revolutionary who had watched African independence turn into its opposite under neocolonialism. He argued that the immediate enemy of the people of Guinea-Bissau was Portugal, but that the fight was against neocolonialism as well. We support progressive nationalist policies or actions which weaken the U.S. empire, like Peru's nationalization of the Exxon and Cerro corporations and the Arab oil boycott. These developments are in opposition to imperialism. However, the movements we look to for leadership are those which fight for the complete freedom of the historical and productive forces from foreign domination controlled by and for the masses of the country. Changes in world politics. Since the ceasefire in Vietnam, the center of world conflict is not so clearly focused. Many contradictions are coming to the force. The contradiction between the Soviet Union and China is deepening. We are studying these issues and we offer the following points. National liberation movements and the socialist nations of the Third World are today the center of world history, providing concentrated leadership and inspiration to the world struggle. They are faced with the awesome responsibility of consolidating their victories and advancing in the face of predatory designs of U.S. imperialism. They have the right to full self-determination. This includes the right to take aid from anyone. They are the best judges of their own needs and the realities of building socialism. The Soviet Union has given substantial aid to liberation movements and to socialist countries like Cuba and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV. Soviet military aid to the Vietnamese was put to the best possible use, shooting down U.S. bomber planes. It is national chauvinism for U.S. revolutionaries to attack a socialist country like Cuba for accepting Soviet aid. The same attack has been made in the past on the DRV. These left-sounding positions display arrogance towards the struggles of third world nations. The Chinese Revolution is a wonderful development in the advance of humanity. Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party have made many important breakthroughs in developing revolutionary strategy in the semi-feudal, semi-colonial world. The thought common to Mao and Ho Chi Minh that the central revolutionary force of our time is the oppressed nations and the peoples of the world leading the liberation struggle against imperialism is the guiding strategic principle of this era. The Chinese have followed a popularly based revolutionary course, educating and involving hundreds of millions of people in discussion and decisions about the economic and political direction of their country. The Chinese have also warred on their own bureaucracy. By launching the Cultural Revolution in 1966, they found a way to combat the rebirth of an exploitative class in China. The Chinese example of continuing the class struggle within socialist society has revolutionized people's vision of the possibilities of socialism. China, a poor country, has given important political and material assistance to the Vietnamese. In 1950, Chinese volunteers joined the people of Korea to halt the U.S. invasion. China is now helping Tanzania and Zambia build the Great Uhuru Railroad, a big step in freeing Southern Africa from dependence on the transport system of the racist governments in Rhodesia and Mozambique. The policy of the government of the USSR, reflected in its ideological stands as well as its state practice, contains conflicting tendencies. While aiding many liberation movements, it has, since Khrushchev's 20th Party Congress speech in 1956, put forward the revisionist line that peaceful transition to socialism is the correct path to revolution. This has been an argument against taking up arms to fight and has forced revolutionaries around the world, including ourselves, to break sharp with the communist parties which have adopted this line. Nixon and Kissinger have used détente as a public relations device to mystify the U.S. people about their real intentions. Their rhetoric about peace in the Mideast went hand in hand with issuing a worldwide military alert which horrified people around the globe. Nixon used his trips to the Soviet Union and China, coming at the time of the massive bombardments of the DRV, to attempt to undermine the Vietnamese resistance. Nixon's lack of success should not obscure his purpose. Revolutionaries everywhere work for world peace and oppose nuclear war. This is a question of particular concern to the U.S. movement, since the U.S. is the only country ever to have used nuclear weapons. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a chilling reminder of the tragic consequences of nuclear weapons in the hands of the imperialists. Revolutionaries in the U.S. as our main enemy, U.S. imperialism. Defeating this enemy will require a lot of work, and it is the unique contribution we can make to the world revolution. Page 96. The Nixon-Kissinger doctrine means the export of fascism to the Third World. Its theme is that the U.S. will arm, train, finance, and support counter-revolution and reaction without intervening with ground troops in every area in which its interests are threatened. The price of Vietnam was too high to pay again and again. This strategy has the broad backing of the ruling class and is not affected by governmental crisis, domestic differences, or Watergate. Neocolonialism removes the most glaring symbol of the subordination of the colonized, the colonial government. It grants formal political independence, but at the same time it attempts to guarantee continued dominance through economic, military, and cultural penetration. Imperialism fosters the most reactionary and backward aspects in feudal and colonized nations, including male supremacy. The more humane aspects are suppressed. Thus, for women in the Third World, the most oppressive aspects of both imperialism and the former society are fused and intensified. Imperialism maintains and heightens the oppression of women on a global scale. Bottom of page 96, a group of Chinese children. Daycare Center, People's Republic of China. Page 97. The struggle continues. Let's look at 3 areas which have been major focal points of world struggle today. Puerto Rico, Guinea-Bissau, and the Palestinian Liberation Movement. Each is different. They each involve the full complexity and diversity of the struggle for national liberation. Puerto Rico. On December 14, 1973, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly passed the report of the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. This resolution buries the U.S. claim that it has no colonies. It reaffirms the inalienable right of the Puerto Rican people to self-determination and independence. Puerto Rico became a U.S. colony in 1898, after years of Spanish rule. Its people have a proud history of resistance, from El Grito de Lares, the great 1868 rebellion against Spain, to the nationalist uprisings in the 1930s and 1950s, to the present-day resurgence both here and on the island. The Puerto Rican people are a divided nation, with about 2.7 million Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico and about 2 million living in the U.S. This is the result of a conscious U.S. strategy. Its scheme to industrialize Puerto Rico in the 1950s was promoted to create a haven for U.S. corporations seeking cheap labor and tax-free production. This led to the destruction of Puerto Rican agriculture and the forced migration of millions, pushed off the land and unable to find work in the crowded cities. Called Operation Bootstrap, this was the widely heralded model of U.S. aid to the Third World. It was a cruel attempt to destroy a nation and divide a people for the benefit of U.S. corporate profit. Emigration continues to be encouraged by the U.S. as a means of diffusing Puerto Rican resistance and dealing with mass unemployment on the island. While helping to tighten U.S. control, the forced migration has also provided a cheap labor supply for low-wage employers in the U.S. 60% of all Puerto Rican workers in this country make less than $100 a week. They work at punishing jobs in the garment and textile industries, as secretaries, in hospitals, and as migrant labor on capitalist farms under the most inhumane conditions. Low pay goes hand in hand with staggering unemployment rates, the permanent condition of the reserve army of labor. Characterized by both special oppression and strategic importance, Puerto Rico has a unique relationship to U.S. imperialism. Puerto Rico is the fifth largest market for U.S. goods in the whole world. Over one half of all U.S. investments in Latin America are there, a staggering figure of $6.8 billion. 85% of Puerto Rico's industrial capital, one of the keys to a country's development, is in the hands of North Americans. San Juan bears the telltale mark of empire: prostitution, hotels, gambling, and slums. Puerto Rico is the military center for the U.S. and the Caribbean. There are 2 nuclear bases, and 13% of the best arable land is used for U.S. military purposes. Troops from the island were used in Panama in 1964 and the Dominican Republic in 1965. This military presence is a warning to all Puerto Ricans and a threat to the rest of the Caribbean, particularly Socialist Cuba. One of the chief examples of Puerto Rico's colonial relationship to the U.S. is the Superport, a petrochemical and mineral processing complex which U.S.-based multinational oil companies use. The Puerto Rican colonial government and the Nixon administration are proposing to build in Puerto Rico. The complex is due to be finished over the next 25 years. Its completion would mean the physical destruction of Puerto Rico as a nation. More rich agricultural land than ever would be destroyed, and the area around the plants would become a vast wasteland. The devastation from oil spills would be incalculable. Estimates are that as many as 1 million Puerto Ricans would be forced to leave the country. The attempt to stop the Superport is a major focus of the Puerto Rican independence movement. When we look at the importance of Puerto Rico to the U.S., we can begin to understand the historic significance of the Puerto Rican movement. The Puerto Rican nation will not die. It is born again and again through the culture and the struggles of the people on the island and the people here. Living in the barrios of major cities, mostly on the East Coast, Puerto Ricans in the U.S. are subjected to many attempts to destroy their culture and their nation. The economic basis of the Puerto Rican community, low-skilled jobs, and small bodega ownership is increasingly shaky. Puerto Ricans face conditions of rotten housing, poor health care, brutal police treatment, and institutionalized racism. Colonialism is at work in the schools. Puerto Rican children are denied the dignity of their nation's history and language, not taught to read, and tracked into useless general diploma programs. Bottom of page 98 is a photo of the Young Lords Party. I believe this is a shot from New York City. Page 99. Against this background to the Puerto Rican nation reemerged inside the U.S. too. In December 1969, the Young Lords took over a church in Spanish Harlem and invited all New York to the People's Church. Puerto Rican communities were stirring. Many fronts were opened up. The struggle for people's control over Lincoln Hospital in New York City, where blacks and Puerto Ricans were abused daily, the ongoing battle for genuine community control of the schools of District 1 in New York, the continuing day-to-day work of groups like El Comite around tenants and welfare rights, the fight to free political prisoners like Barton Sostre, Gabriel and Francisco Torres, and the nationalist fighters, the defense of Carlos Feliciano and Pancho Cruz. The present-day resistance has its roots in the movement and the fighters who have come before. In Don Pedro Albizu Campos, the great nationalist leader, in Lolita Lebrón, Rafael Cancer Miranda, Irving Flores, and Andres Figueroa Corredero. Still in jail after 21 years of imprisonment for the armed attack on the U.S. Congress in 1954, Oscar Colasso, another nationalist fighter who remains in prison for the attempted assassination of Harry Truman in 1950. Many forces and organizations now carry on the struggle. The UN resolution was presented by the Puerto Rican Independence Party, PIP, and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, PSP. The PSP was invited as an observer to the recent Non-Aligned Nations Conference in Algiers. The Puerto Rican movement has continued its armed resistance to U.S. imperialism through the actions of the Armed Commandos of Liberation, CAL, who have attacked U.S.-owned companies and the Condado Hotel Strip, center of U.S. tourism. Within the U.S., MIRA, an armed revolutionary Puerto Rican group, has attacked many businesses and large stores. The Puerto Rican movement is a living bond to national liberation struggles in Latin America, an explosive threat to U.S. power. As it continues to grow stronger and more forceful, activists from every movement are pushed to give concrete support through action and organizing. Learning the history of Puerto Rico, understanding and supporting the Puerto Rican movement, and learning to speak Spanish, the people's language, are all necessities for movement organizers in the U.S. Independence for Puerto Rico. Self-determination for the Puerto Rican people. Free all Puerto Rican political prisoners. Stop the Superport. Bottom of page 99 is a map of Puerto Rico. Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau is a small country of 800,000 people on the west coast of Africa. It was once from her shores that Portugal initiated the notorious West African slave trade over 400 years ago. Since 1963, a fierce people's war has been waged by the forces of the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and the Cape Verde Islands, also known as the PAIGC. They have been fighting and defeating over 35,000 Portuguese troops who have been armed, supplied, and trained by the U.S. and other NATO powers. On September 24, 1973, Aristides Pereira, Secretary General of the PAIGC, declared Guinea-Bissau independent from Portuguese rule. He announced that the new Republic of Guinea-Bissau would continue to battle the Portuguese soldiers on its territory and would also press for the liberation of the Cape Verde Islands. Soon after, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to extend recognition to the new nation. The U.S., along with South Africa, Portugal, and Israel, opposed the resolution. 82 nations have now formally recognized the new government. Revolution has profoundly changed Guinean life. The PAIGC has liberated almost 3/4 of the countryside. Many people now attend schools in places where no schools existed before. Healthcare has become a priority in a country where only one hospital was built by Portugal in over 100 years. Women have assumed a central role in the revolutionary process, breaking from the limits and oppression of the colonial past. Liberation continues to flower in the midst of battle. This is what the PAIGC calls building the revolution as we fight. Amílcar Cabral was the leader of the PAIGC until his assassination by Portuguese agents in January 1973. Cabral was a powerful, unifying spokesperson for all the African liberation movements. He was one of the truly great original revolutionary theorists of this era, a dedicated fighter in the cause of liberation. His murder was a cruel blow to Africa and the world revolution. Guinea-Bissau is the first Portuguese colony to declare independence. Its liberation struggle has had an effect in Africa similar to the worldwide effects of the Vietnamese struggle. It has been a catalyst for the movements in the other Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, and has spurred the rise of revolution throughout southern Africa. At the same time, the liberation movements have won more open support from the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which represents a broad range of African states. In Angola, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA, has liberated 1/3 of the land, territory inhabited by 1 million Angolans. In Mozambique, the guerrillas of the Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo, has launched a powerful new offensive against the centers of Portuguese power. Frelimo forces have crossed the Zambezi River, the supposedly impenetrable natural defense line of Portugal in Mozambique. They have challenged Portugal's planned operation of the huge Cabora Bassa Dam on the Zambezi River. Combined with attacks on the strategic railway between landlocked Rhodesia and the Mozambican port of Beira, these Frelimo operations have shaken Portugal's hold on the country. Portugal is a poor country, run since 1924 by a fascist dictatorship. It spends over 50% of its budget on the military and has fielded an army of 250,000 troops to fight in Africa. Like all colonialist and imperialist countries, Portugal is now seeing the chickens come home to roost. Its attempts to crush liberation in Africa have created the conditions for rebellion at home. Over 100,000 youth have fled the country to avoid the draft. Others have deserted from the army. Armed attacks within Portugal have risen. In April, a troop ship about to sail from Lisbon to Guinea-Bissau with 1,000 men aboard was rocked by an explosion. The action was claimed by the Revolutionary Brigade organization. The recent military coup in Portugal reflects the success of the African guerrillas and the deep opposition to the wars among large numbers of Portuguese citizens. It could be said of the ousted fascist government of Marcelo Caetano what Cabral said of the death of the previous Portuguese dictator Salazar. Africa was the disease which killed him. The coup has unleashed a wave of open anti-fascist organizing among the Portuguese people and has also triggered intensified popular pressure to end the African wars. It is doubtful, however, that the new junta will agree to the only possible solution in Africa, complete independence for Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. The junta's leader, General Antonio Spinola, fought with the fascists in the Spanish Civil War, served with the Nazi army during World War II, and was the major Portuguese commander in the losing war against Guinea-Bissau. Spinola has floated out visions of neocolonial non-solutions, which have been categorically rejected by the liberation forces.
Luis Cabral, the new president of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau, has said, "Spinola talks a lot, and he has been known to make a lot of promises. But we know that the only language he listens to comes from the guns of our forces, hitting him and hitting him and hitting him again." Portugal could not sustain its colonial wars without the aid of the Western imperial powers. As a NATO member, it receives arms and supplies from the US and Western Europe. Southern Africa is of great strategic importance to imperialism, a source of valuable raw materials, cheap labor, and high-profit investments. Victories for the PAIGC, Frelimo, and the MPLA could pose a serious threat to racist rule in the whole area. Consequently, the battle lines have hardened, and the United States has openly supported Portugal and the white racist governments in South Africa and Rhodesia. In 1971, the Nixon government gave Portugal a $436 million loan in return for continued use of the Azores Islands as a military base. United States companies have had a growing stake in Portuguese success. They now are the third largest investors in the Portuguese colonies. Gulf Oil Company pays Portugal $62 million a year for its rights to oil resources on the Angolan coast, also known as Cabinda. In November 1973, Gulf acknowledged the discovery of new deposits in this area, which it has called the most prolific south of the Middle East. When the Arab states halted oil shipments to Portugal and South Africa, Gulf helped tack up the slack, sending oil to both countries and Mozambique. Top of page 102 is a page of the liberated zones of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Over half of all U.S. African investments are in South Africa, which functions as a junior partner of Western imperialism. South Africa is currently fighting liberation movements in Namibia, Southwest Africa, Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, and within its own borders. As Portugal loses its hold over Angola and Mozambique, more direct South African intervention is likely. This is the Southern Axis in Africa: Portugal, South Africa, the United States, the NATO powers, Rhodesia, lined up against millions of Africans demanding self-determination. The fight for liberation in Southern Africa is a strategic center point in the battle against imperialism. The African liberation struggles have been hidden wars, rarely mentioned in the U.S. press. It has taken the concerted work of the Black movement to break the silence in this country. Black organizations have pushed forward boycott campaigns against Gulf oil and Portuguese products. They have opposed U.S. support for Portugal and South Africa and are now demanding U.S. recognition of the new Republic of Guinea-Bissau. Longshoremen in Baton Rouge, Baltimore, and San Francisco have refused to unload shipments of Rhodesian chrome brought here in violation of a UN ban. All these activities are important for our movement to support and help build. With the current crisis in Portugal, this is a key time to intensify worldwide support for the African liberation movements. While some movement organizers are now engaged in work around Africa, many more of us should make it a part of our daily work. This involves both commitment to action and a political education. A good place to begin with is Amilcar Cabral's writing, Revolution in Guinea, Return to the Source, Our People Are Our Mountains, and Basil Davidson's Liberation of Guinea. Learn from the people. A basis can be laid within the movement of a new level of solidarity with the African struggles. Portugal, out of Africa, no U.S. or NATO aid to Portugal or South Africa. Recognize Guinea-Bissau. There's a little graphic that says Gulf kills on page 102 at the bottom. Turning the page to 103, it is a map of historic Palestine as it is consistently occupied by the Israeli Zionist forces, including maps from 1947, 1967, 1974, and again 1974. Highlighting the occupation in the West Bank, as well as the Golan Heights and Gaza. Top of page 104, the Palestinian movement. People have been confused and misled into thinking that the situation in the Middle East is impossibly complicated. Blindness to the Palestinian people is at the root of this quandary. The Palestinian struggle is a genuine and deep-rooted movement for national liberation. As a people, they have actively opposed colonization of their lands from the beginning, against the Turkish rulers, against the British Empire, and now against Zionism as embedded in the State of Israel. This is the key to the past and the future of the Mideast. There is a sobering similarity between the situation of the Palestinians and the history of the Native American people. The reality is that Israel is an expansionist power based on Zionist colonialism. For 7 years, the Palestinian liberation movement has been the leading resistance to Zionism and Israeli military supremacy in the Middle East. In the October War, the Arab nations delivered a major blow to Israel, destroying the myth of the Israeli military invincibility, weakening her position in the world, and heightening contradictions within Israel itself. The Arab demands were for the return of the Israeli-occupied land seized during the 1967 Six-Day War, in which Israel more than tripled in size. At the core of Middle East politics, unsettled by the October War or the U.S.-Soviet negotiations about the Middle East, are the Palestinian people. The Palestinians are 3.3 million landless people, dispersed primarily in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. They have become the people of the diaspora, exiled from their homeland of thousands of years by the State of Israel and the ideology of Zionism. Referred to in the U.S. as Arab terrorists, Arab refugees, or Southern Syrians, the Palestinians have been struggling to return to their land and for their right to self-determination and liberation. Their claim is just. It is based on the fact of Palestinian national existence, a common heritage, the labor of their ancestors, the cultivation of citrus and olives trade, the building of the cities of Haifa, Jaffa, and Lydda, their culture, their dignity as a people. For 24 years, hundreds of thousands of proud Palestinians have been forced into hastily set up UN refugee camps with no means of survival except food depots and UN rations. Displaced again in 1967, this time from the occupied territories, the Palestinians faced a second exodus, twice refugees. The atrocious camps, originally organized as a temporary measure, are the living grievance. They express the contradiction embodied in the existence of Israel at the expense of Palestine. Israel has never recognized the Palestinians' rights. Zionist leaders have rejected UN resolutions calling for the return of the refugees to their homeland, rejected the idea of the so-called Palestinian people, and insisted that they are the Arabs' problem, not theirs. From the outset, Israel has worked toward a purely Jewish state. It was after the Holocaust in Europe, in which half the Jewish population of Europe was slaughtered by the fascists, that the creation of Israel became a reality. The United States and other Western powers denied immigration to Jewish refugees and encouraged migration to the land of Palestine. Zionists colluded with the imperialists to create Israel on already populated land. From its inception, Zionism has been an imperial ideology, presented as an alternative to communism. Theodor Herzl, recognized as the founder of modern Zionism, has toyed with the idea of establishing a Jewish state in Uganda or Kenya and was blunt about Zionist alliances. Quote, England, with her possessions in Asia, should be most interested in Zionism, for the shortest road to India in by way of Palestine. England's great politicians were the first to recognize the need for colonial expansion. That is why Great Britain's ensign flies on all oceans. And so I must believe that here in England, the idea of Zionism, which is a colonial idea, should be easily and quickly understood in its true and most modern form. End quote. Israel is a settler colony. After World War II, with the British driven out, the UN partitioned Palestine in favor of the Zionists. The Haganah and the Irgun, Zionist terror organizations, initiated a campaign of violence against the Palestinian people to force them off their land and out of the cities, to create a state clean of Arabs. At Deir Yassin, the Irgun killed every one of the 254 Palestinian inhabitants on April 9, 1948. Poorly armed, over 1 million Palestinians fled over the borders, leaving everything behind. Israel seized and confiscated their immense lands and their property under the absentee property laws and justified the occupation with the lie that the Palestinians left of their own free will. The 12% of the Palestinian people who remained behind became hired labor on their own lands or in settlements, and lived under military control, treated as inferior people. Israel is an expansionist country. In 3 successive wars since partition, they have conquered and occupied Egyptian land, Syrian land, and Jordanian land. 40% of the Israeli budget is taken up by war. During the October War, the U.S. airlifted supplies of up to 800 tons of war equipment per day to Israel through the Portuguese-held Azores, and Nixon got a $2.2 billion request for military spending for Israel. Israeli government policy is periodic war, eternal war imposed by destiny. Israel is a class society. Not only is it based on the special colonial relationship of super exploitation of native Palestinians, but half the Jewish population are immigrants from Asia and Africa, Oriental Jews, who face particular exploitation, doing unskilled labor, living in the worst housing, discriminated against by European Jews. In addition, because Israel is a religious state, non-Jews are denied basic rights. These conflicts have been submerged by Zionism, yet the tensions and contradictions have produced frustration and opposition among some sectors in Israel, particularly the youth. Israel's economy is weak, in spite of the enormous theft of the Palestinian land and labor. It is dependent on foreign capital, German reparations, U.S. aid, and billions from Western donations. In 1967, Israel received 10% of all U.S. foreign aid. The Nixon administration boasts that it has given Israel more aid than the combined total of all previous administrations. Israel is a client state of U.S. imperialism, serving as policeman and favored partner in the exploitation of the Middle East and North Africa. Top of page 106. Result of Israeli air raid, May 19, 1974, on Rashida camp for Palestinian people, South Lebanon. The Zionist government in Israel supported the U.S. in Vietnam, supports the fascist junta in Chile, and opposes all liberation movements in Africa. Since the 1967 war, 26 African nations have severed relations with Israel on the basis of Israeli occupation of Arab land. This is also a consequence of Israel's attempt to penetrate and dominate African development. South Africa and Rhodesia continue ties with Israel. Zionist colonialism has cultivated a worldwide image as the besieged victim, the heroic people holding off the barbarians. A semi-socialist state where strong and free Sabras made the desert bloom, the refuge and guarantee against anti-Semitism. The reality is very different. The Zionist state is clearly the aggressor, the source of violence and war in the Middle East, and the occupier of stolen lands. The military solutions of periodic war and expansion, reprisal raids, and constant preparation for war are the consequences of intransient opposition to a politically cooperative future with Palestinians and Arabs. It is racist and expansionist, the enemy of Palestinians, the Arab people, and the Jewish people. Israeli society internally reflects this imperial reality. Militarized, commercial, and competitive. The myth of socialism on the kibbutz is a powerful one, but the kibbutzim never gained more than 5% of the Jewish population of Palestine or Israel, and are no more evidence for Israel being a socialist country. Many of the kibbutzim are on land which Palestinian peasants were driven from. Some directly exploit Palestinian labor, and they are all subsidized by Zionist funds. Zionism does not represent Jews. It is a racist ideology based on the claim that God chose a people superior to others. It has been consistently used as an alternative to class struggle and socialism for Jews, undermining Jewish progressive and working class traditions. There is no basis for the claim that Zionism is a bulwark against anti-Semitism. The Zionist state has allied with the most repressive and intolerant, racist and anti-Semitic regimes in the world: Nixon, Tho, South Africa, and the Chilean junta. The white movement in the U.S. has failed to give clear and open support to the Palestinian struggle. We have not taken on the necessary task of exposing the myths about Israel which cloak the true situation and disarm many people. The nature of the state of Israel is protected by intense passions and by the real memories of Nazism and anti-Semitism. But despite ancestors at Auschwitz and relatives in Israel, we cannot escape the responsibility of opposing the crimes of the Israeli government and the consequences of Zionist ideology. From exile and despair, the Palestinians have slowly developed their resistance capability. They began to lead and define their own political and guerrilla movement, which accelerated after the Arab defeat in the 1967 war. Their brave battle at Karama in 1968 helped make them the focal point of resistance to Zionism and galvanize the national identity and yearnings of a whole people. The forces and organizations of Palestinian liberation trained thousands of Palestinians and began to mobilize their people to provide health and administrative services to reclaim their history. The active participation of Palestinian women in the struggle for liberation challenges the long history of women's subservience and dependence, which has been bolstered by religion and family. The Union for Palestinian Women is active within all these camps, with a primary focus on education and fighting the economic oppression of women. The Palestinian strategy has been to carry out operations against the Zionist state and Israeli-held territory, to remind the world of the Palestinian people's cause. Their solution is a democratic secular Palestine that will accommodate all Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The Palestinian Liberation Organization is the umbrella organization which coordinates policy of the liberated forces. The Palestinian Liberation Movement is a most progressive force in the Middle East, as in the revolution of South Yemen, known as the Cuba of the Middle East. The Palestinians have educated masses of people, opened up the revolution to women, and demonstrated fearless determination to win. Their proposal of a democratic secular state stands in marked contrast to rhetorical threats to annihilate the Jews or reactionary expressions of anti-Semitism. The Palestinians make a firm distinction between Zionism and Jews. The presence of the Palestinian struggle is a touchstone for other contradictions in the Middle East. The Palestinian freedom fighters are a highly politicized group, a militant nucleus, scattered in 5 host countries. A principle of the liberation movement has been that the revolution in Palestinian origin and Arab in extension. The dedicated Fedayeen have stimulated wide support among Arab people. Their struggle and their determined independence from Arab governments in whose land they live, train and organize, makes them a force for revolutionary change throughout the Arab world. Often, Arab governments have rhetorically used the Palestinian cause to maintain their own power and control, while consistently leaving the Palestinians out of negotiations and excluding them from dignified life within their countries. These rulers are fully aware of the threat posed to their power by a vital liberation movement strategically located in their midst. Yet they are somewhat restrained by the immense popularity of the movement among the people of the Arab countries. This precarious balance was shattered by Black September. Over half the population of Jordan was Palestinian when King Hussein unleashed a major military attack to liquidate the Palestinian Revolution in September 1970. The U.S. backed Hussein with a continuous flow of arms and the threat of intervention with the Sixth Fleet. Thousands of Palestinians were murdered, refugee camps were bombarded and destroyed, leaders were executed. This was a severe setback. The Palestinians have since regrouped in Lebanon and Syria and rebuilt their forces. Palestinian independence is opposed with reactionary schemes by Jordan, completely opposed with military terror by Israel, and manipulated by the United States. The U.S.-sponsored notion of stability and status quo in the Middle East is an attempt to preserve U.S. imperialist control of oil, using Zionist power as the cat's paw. The Mideast has become a world focus of struggles over oil resources and control of strategic sea and air routes. Yet, the Palestinian struggle is at the heart of other conflicts in the Middle East. Only the Palestinian struggle can determine the solution, which reflects the aspirations of their people. No settlements in the Mideast which exclude the Palestinians will resolve the conflict. Palestinian liberation will not be suppressed. The U.S. people have been seriously deceived about Palestinians and Israel. This calls for a campaign to educate and focus attention on the true situation, teach-ins, debates, and open clear support for Palestinian liberation. Reading about the Palestinian movement, the disinherited by Fawaz Turki, enemy of the sun, opposing U.S. aid to Israel. Our silence or acceptance of pro-Zionist policy is a form of complicity with U.S.-backed aggression and terror, and a betrayal of internationalism. Self-determination for the Palestinian people, U.S. out of the Mideast, end aid to Israel.